This is sort of my makeshift fly-by-night version of a TED Talk. The whole notion of how we represent reality to ourselves has a lot to do with how we interpret reality and what things we can activate, what capacities we can actually activate to interface with it properly. I want to go back in time to, my growing up. I played all sports. Not so good, not so interested, I guess, in baseball, except for hitting the ball, the long bomb. And basketball, not so good. I remember swimming. I thought I was a good sprinter. But, I petered out pretty quickly. And I remember running the race, probably grade 5 or grade 6. Princess Margaret School, we had to run around the whole perimeter of the schoolyard, which had been a big field and so on. And sheer determination I would always have that I was going to win, but then I pulled up with this stitch right near the end, and it was very telling and a very killing feeling. At any rate, I say that because there's a male, mentality. So also football. I was actually captain of a championship football team. Played hockey, up to minor midget, and lacrosse. Played senior B lacrosse when I was 16. Boxed. I did some boxing. Was actually on a card with Nicky Furlano and Benny Gwindon, leader of Satan's Choice. This was in Bramley. And so boxing and tennis and so on and so forth. But there's an identification, of course, in terms of male syndrome, maleness, that identifies closely with sports. And it wasn't really till I became depressed around 2002, 2003, 2004 that I realized I had to sort of dig my way out of the depression, and I started reading people, and I started developing ideas about the spectrum, the overall human spectrum of the mental spectrum. And part of my reading of dozens of books on the brain, the brain that changes itself, the runaway brain, etc., etc. Two of the most profound influences were Simon Baron Cohen, who talked about autism and talked about this, the mind having a specificity, and particularly with savants and so on, that made their consciousness somewhat arithmetic. So Daniel Tammet, the savant, could recite pi for 4.5 hours, learn a language like Icelandic in a week, but not remember the faces of people who were close to him, his lover, partner. Had to keep new photographs, or if he was interviewed by you on television and he ran into you an hour later outside on the sidewalk, he wouldn't recognize you. So there was a trade-off there in terms of this abilities that he had, and how the spectrum has to do with this very finite correlation area, this finitude that he can zero in on. And he can't, as he mentions in his books, hypothesize or imagine things. He has to have the derivative bracketing. And this is characteristic, as Simon Baron Cohen would reveal to me, of the autism spectrum, and also definitive is this sort of lack of subjectivity, this inability to grapple with particularly human emotions. So Rain Man, when Tom Cruise hugs him and he freaks out, is because that's an abyss, outside the limits of their finitude. Things become very threatening very quickly, and emotions are one of those things that are very threatening, and it's also emotions that are very threatening for many males, and they cover up that with this aggressive behavior. There's millions of lonely men who cannot even understand or apprehend the first steps of gaining intimacy with a female, given, you know, their nature of trying to sort of cover up this vulnerability. And I think I'd be more relaxed if I could just liberate myself somehow here. There, that's better. This whole notion that I'm presenting myself to you and you don't know me, and my suggestion is that mirror neurons, which autistics tend to lack, are things that embrace, you know, so much of what we are humanly, that this plasticity of, you know, this, first of all, this empathy that we generate and mirror neurons that then engage, you know, diversity, because we walk a mile in someone's shoes, we see the perspective. But it's not just a theoretical knowledge, it's not a left brain matter-of-fact thing. It's an embrace of the understanding, the perception, the point of view, the actual physicality of walking, you know, a mile in someone else's shoes. And as I read more about the brain, I encountered Eric Kendall, and I saw, gee whiz, here's the spectrum thing. On the other end of the spectrum is, you know, people who have a lot of intersubjectivity and a lot of subjectivity, are creative, and that there's an exponentiality to, you know, what their trajectories are in terms of, you know, disentangling themselves from what's embedded in terms of, you know, cultural imperatives and bracketing and so on. So these people in Vienna at the turn of the century, so Eric Kendall's book, The Age of Insight, he talks about this role of empathy and this notion that there's this synergy that develops and unlocks the brains and creates an atmosphere, you know, sort of like Greenwich Village or any hotspot of creative endeavor, Paris, in many epochs. There's this energy that generates from things that are happening if people are tuned into it. And maybe there's even a ripple effect in terms of the artist who's, you know, extricated selfhood from that intentionally to preserve, you know, certain thresholds of the imagination. And that's the thing about that end of the spectrum, is the imagination, the ability to grasp analogy and allegory, and this sort of intuitiveness that you know, contradicts the type of photocopying, or well, Daniel Tammet talks about the Rain Man not having a photographic memory. He gives him that thing to read and realizes that it's this layering of information that is important to the Rain Man style. This is the real to life Rain Man and Daniel Tammet and him getting together. Daniel Tammet being called the Brain Man, and being an autistic savant and exhibiting and articulating many of these things. And these are articulated in the book Switched On, as well as that character, that human being, moves from autistic consciousness into realms of subjectivity and creativity that enlarge the neural map, enlarge, you know, what's being fired and wired, and what's being typified by what is being fired and wired. So here we have the autism side of the spectrum and human mental health, and over here we have the ability through analogy to create trajectories that can be understood, communicated, like thought shapes and the chrysalids and so on, that we have this mirroring capability of embracing so much when we have the door opened to humanity. And what we can do with that in a 100 billion neuron universe, in terms that this 100 billion neuron universe wants to fire and wire in this, you know, this very congested territory in the frontal cortex, which develops parallax and and coherence relative to the point of view, so it preempts what it preempts. And for most people, given modalities of McLuhanism, of hot and cold media, of the manipulation towards this sort of digital shallowness, this sort of upfrontness of engagement that doesn't have much resolution into the backdrop, and particularly the backdrop of history, and particularly the progression of ideas and what we've learned about humanity, about psychiatry, about the physical body, about the physical universe, about dark matter, dark energy, and dark flow, and the fact that we now don't know anything virtually about that 95%, and what causality that has in terms of quantum wave bands and particular orientations of polarities, and what that all means in terms of I've written about Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Jung and their whole notion. I think it's psychoids as a sort of psychological force that intervenes in quantum experiments, but also intervenes in terms of human interaction as a real, and that the conscious universe is something that one taps into, this whole universe consciously breathing and oscillating, or as T-Rex would say, the cosmic vibrating like a bumblebee, which is a pretty cool image. At any rate, this notion that there is a spectrum was important, and this was important to me, resolving issues of depression. And during the depression, because I spent so much time in bed, my body began to atrophy, my feet swelled up. I thought I'd never ever get over that. I thought the pain in my feet was, made me walk on eggshells and so on. But as a former athlete, and that's why I went through that. Oh yeah, and the other thing was gymnastics. I loved doing giant swings on the high bar and so on, and front giant swings. I never got to the reverse. At any rate, having a relatively speaking, I suppose, athlete's body and persona, when your body atrophies like this under the depression reality. Depression is something that calls for reformation of one's plasticity, that your own identity has for some reason brought you down and brought you into the quagmire of what depression is. Usually, it's sort of, oh, somebody please recognize I'm here, or you're in love with something, or a job or something, and the whole thing collapses. Somebody lets you down, somebody else lets you down, life starts pissing you off, whatever. There's usually a confluence of things, but it pulls back. There's a Leonard Cohen song about pulling back the flesh to see the serpent eat its tail, and that's essentially what happens in depression, is that the skin of selfhood, as conducted and concocted as one grows up and navigates life and so on. So there's that part of that. There's part of the athlete part of me, the part of demoralization. The further demoralization when I did try to start migrating plasticity and also accessing neurogenesis in terms of my paintings, because I think these are the important things that cause the fluidity to percolate in the brain, to create an adventure for plasticity that it migrates to and polarizes everything. It's sort of like an internal synergy between the orchestrated aspects of the brain, not just this frontal cortex that wants to narrow and accumulate a perspective, but all the brain, and particularly that corpus callosum where left and right brain meet and diffract through each other to the other side of the body and oscillate in terms of energy and so on. And this is fundamental to the constructs of the human brain and the anatomy of the human body. It's science established for a long time now and yet we don't really think about it as such. And the left brain is the brain that wants to fill in the blanks and at the end of the day have a final entry. The right brain, on the other hand, has this big picture of reality, and certainly The Master and His Emissary by McGilchrist is the most definitive book ever on this territory, left and right brain, by examining physical damage, lesions in the brain, and what's operative and what's not, and what's more malleable and flexible and renewable, and what's not. And so here we have a picture of a lot of what I'm talking about and thinking about. This defeated athlete's body, coming out of it, trying to fire and wire and imaging. Then in 2011 I was put flat on my back in horrible pain. Didn't think I was really going to make it through the MRI and the CAT scan, and Dr. Fazel, the neurosurgeon at Sunnybrook, pointed in the direction of surgery. And a week before I pulled out, I got cold feet. Surgery, all surgery is invasive. I had had one good back surgery by Dr. Fazel in 1992. And he was going to address the same thing further up the spine. So I don't know, it was just an intuitive thing that made me back out of that. And then of course I have to plasticize my way back to health and strength in my back from that. So I get to employ some of the plasticity experiments that generate the sort of energy that polarizes the brain and the body favorably, disposing them to that. And I guess the thing then with the imagination and Samuel Taylor Coleridge talking about plasticity and fusing all our emotions into the one, and that being a sort of transcendent apparatus by which we can understand. So, the higher in the levels of consciousness, the higher the perch, the more the layers reveal the topography of the past, the topography of the present, and the coordinates that, calculatedly project into the future and carry us with them. Regardless of how we feel or think about it, that's the force, the inertia of civilization and its certain amplitudes and focal points, and different now. Now that the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, has reared its ugly head. It's the day before the first day of spring. It's 2020. And I'm addressing you about the brain, about empathy, and being able to translate yourself into another experience and the dimensionality that one can actually develop. Something simple like this morning, a clear, cold winter morning. And I was listening to some music, sort of waltz music, and I was thinking about skating as a young man and public skating in Orangeville, Ontario. And the sort of waltz music they would play, so I was thinking of skating and transporting my mind to a morning adjacent to this morning, imagining it skating on the Rideau Canal in Ottawa at daybreak with, my blades on the ice being the first blades, and the way that catches the ice, the way the white pattern forms in and under the ice. Pretty cool. But what I'm suggesting is that depending where you are on the spectrum, that may not be an image that you have access to precipitating. So here, let's put it in motion here. Over here we have autism, then Asperger's, than male extreme syndrome. Male extreme syndrome is bunching right up with that because the thrust in a male extreme syndrome is to participate. Think of, Tom Cruise in Magnolia, or talk about what goes on in some male minds, presumably from, Bill Cosby, Charlie Rose, to Harvey Weinstein, to whatever, this male thing that has to, use the club method, this barbarism in terms of sexuality, to overcome the fact that they are incapable of, being emotional. I think, in contrast, Leonard Cohen and the exploration of emotional initiatives in the structuring of consciousness and the gamut of things that it takes to orchestrate a complex mind so that the mind doesn't diminish to this nucleus of practical reality. The nuns experiment in Montreal that's been going on for decades, demonstrating that a nun who has a journal that is more creatively endowed in terms of amplitude, in terms of scenes, describing her little brother going to the fair, being so happy and so on, and how close they were before he died, as opposed to another nun saying, I had 3 siblings and 2 of them died, and moving on, because that inflated or uninflated life, and this is the whole prospect of where existentialism leaves us. Willy Loman, does he have much ability to get any sort of trajectory going beyond the circumscribed reality of his own culture that he has implemented around him, his attitudes towards his sons in business, and the jungle, and and the demoralization of being someone who is undervalued when he goes in about his job, and Howard is listening to the his new tape recorder, obsessed with it, and here's Willie Loman ready to pour out his guts in terms of what he needs, in terms of some sort of retirement package and so on. Very much like Salman Rushdie on a book I just started reading. He too has his character, but it's a different thing that the other, I think the character getting let go is Dr. Smile, Dr. Smile's cousin, the main, anyways. A sidelight issue, as Salman Rushdie squishes together, the shape of things in an interesting momentum, capturing the inertia of our fidgety consciousness, our consciousness moving on before we've touched down, and so on. The runaway brain, and changing the brain constantly in terms of the upgrade with the phones, and that all bracketed within a part of, that then dampens and then the brain, in terms of Alzheimer's and so on, gives up. The brain grows into this larger and larger neural map in terms of these dancing dendrites and these formations of axons and communication channels, literally. And then the brain sort of settles down and creates this neurological ceiling, and it doesn't want to. It finds it uncomfortable to deviate from, the automatic responses, the habitual responses. And that creates this rigidity within the personality, its inability to, like with Botox, if you give Botox to somebody and they lose expression in their own face, ironically, they lose the ability to interpret the expression in the face of others. And I'm suggesting something similar happens when you read literature, catharsis, Aristotle, identify with someone, empathize with someone, experience what they've experienced, have your heart ripped out by the tragedy, and then have it, as Leonard Cohen would say, the broken heart healed. Broken heart healed was a very strong heart, a stronger heart, and very important to the evolution of selfhood in terms of the complexity that the 100 billion neuron universe demands of us. And when we fall short of that, things start short-circuiting, and the dendrites start. They don't get the juice anymore, the vitality that they need, because neurogenesis is virtual zero, neuroplasticity nil, and the character has fallen into caricature and redundancy, and the brain doesn't find that very exciting. And because the brain doesn't find that very exciting, it starts tuning off, and they start shriveling up, the brain starts shriveling up, and then the arcing happens because of the electricity, the biochemistry of the brain, the polarities shifting in the brain. This roped off territory, like Detroit there a few years ago, with the grass growing up through the roads and the sidewalks and everything in degenerative state. That's the abandoned brain. As the brain begins to focal point on what it is, what it has streaming, your God is where you fire and wire. And everybody, whether they think they have a belief system or not, has a belief system in where they fire and wire. It's where you articulate yourself most frequently, most frequent flyer status, that will be, insulated, and it will have its speed limit accelerated because of the myelin that's going to coat the axon and the nerve impulse, and and epiphany, like Saul on the road to Damascus, falls off his donkey for 3 days, I believe it is. He's blind and disoriented, and when he comes to, he sees the world differently. He's had an epiphany, like many of the people after 9/11 and other crises often are shook up to the point that that little reality that you turn up inside down with the snowflakes that's all contained becomes, not the place where one wants to remain. So this whole sort of Willy Loman syndrome of making out, making do, and just, keeping things together, the American dream becoming more elusive as one ages, and one's age becoming, something difficult. So here we have, this part of the spectrum is male extreme syndrome, where males have been advised and concocted to be, nasty in terms of, well, Hitler's youth in the JoJo movie. To be a Hitler's youth, he has to show that he can cut, a rabbit. So he runs like a rabbit, JoJo Rabbit. So he's confronting a situation where he doesn't want to kill a rabbit, nor would I. I would find that, integrally violating my conscious rights as a human being. And yet a lot of males think this is maleness, enduring maleness, like Full Metal Jacket, when that sergeant major or whatever he is chewing out these poor kids from, all these Christian kids come and in the most gross, vulgar, reality rendering talk are limited, immediately intimidated, immediately, contrived immediately, baptism by fire immediately. And yet this is, this is the barbarian stance. This is human being a soldier. I was watching a thing, some rock star whose father was, I think he originated the Tamil Tigers, and I think she said, if I remember correctly, when asked about all this struggle and so on, she said she found it juvenile. And one has to recognize that a lot of women, particularly up to a certain age, before they are conscripted into the male identity stamp of approval, day-to-day operation of society, often have a more complex brain than men. They're off to a stronger emotional start and more aware. And that's part of, autism is going to hit more males, like I think 5 times as many as females. And this whole idea that males lean towards arithmetic and science to authenticate objectivity and to downsize what they think they need emotionally going forward is all part of this. You see it in the sports world, on sports reel before the virus. There was one hockey player intimidating a smaller hockey player. This was professional NHL stuff. Right there in the hallway, right in the kid's face. And this made it on the sports reel, but I never heard of anybody reacting to that. This is hockey's, internal code. It's like the blue code for police. And that's why so many police suicide, because the ones with empathy can't believe that it's, the aggressive ones who've taken, hold. And this is the problem with democracy, is that the personalities that clinically, gravitate towards politics are ones that need the empowerment in an extrinsic sense, that don't empower from within. So really, they're completely the antithetical to what the job really requires, which is, somebody of more philosophical bent who's not interested in the currency of the job. But male entities have, and this is in fraternities, and well, the Supreme Court. The guy who got on the Supreme Court, who was accused by his fellow student of rape, sexual assault, at least, I forget. It's everywhere in society, particularly in societies that seem to class structure that you aren't worth as much as the next guy unless you make as much money as the next guy. So what I'm talking about is that we have to navigate the world by plasticity. We have to anticipate, have this prehension, where things are going by this trajectory of thought, by the imagination. And, getting back to the spectrum. On the other hand of the spectrum, then you have the imagination. You have the ability to deal with metaphor. You have the ability to deal with analogy and allegory and simile and poetic nuance and so on and so forth. Psychology, emotions, all these things become part of this. And the answer in terms of autism, as I've written about it, is to try to enhance their subjectivity by seeing themselves on camera. I'm totally convinced that Daniel Tammet improved because of this. Think about the character in the guy in Switched On. Think about, there's 2 other cases I know personally where cameras have been used to liberate that level of self-consciousness. And that is so important in terms of allowing the character to incite mirror neurons towards the self of all things. And then, one can work with the elevation of subjectivity in terms of that autistic, totally, well, here, maybe I'll overstate it, but I don't think so. I think it was 1929, there was an eclipse that, with the red shift in terms of the photographs, showed that Einstein was correct about relativity and how gravity, moved things. Light, I guess it was it light? At any rate, a guy has written a book called Autism on LSD, which I believe verifies, all my conjectures about what one needs to address in terms of autism. For him, it cured his autism. For the ones that studies were done on in the 60s, it seemed to cure their autism. Nobody wants to run off and start saying cure, cure, cure. But quite frankly, within the autism community, there's this acceptance that, training and tapping into this hopeful ability that the autistic child or adult can establish a routine that makes them more self-sufficient. And to me, if you had a park with a bunch of autistics and had a lot of creative things going on, where you could sit down and play a guitar, and some musicians playing that aren't autistic, and lots of cameras set up and lots of screens running in real time what's going on around the yard, cultivating this threshold of understanding that comes from self-imaging and self-concept and so on. So I guess when I come to the concept of which I'm working on right now is that changing one's brain plasticity also changes one's body, and that's the hope in terms of my surgery decision back in 2011. But I have to respect my back, and the divining rod of one's self-centeredness should be within this orchestration of brain, so that one area isn't preempted. And that was certainly the case. When I went to university, people were questioning, why would you get a Bachelor of Arts? Because only Bachelor of Science students are hireable. And that again was an indicator of a society that is tilting, running to that side of the boat, as it were. In terms of autism, you've got all sorts of pathologies that overlap there. In terms of male extreme syndrome, preoccupation with routine, preoccupation with numbers, and that focal pointing within the spectrum. Now, we all have autism within us, bipolarity, depression, ADHD. We all have that, but when you reduce all that to its common denominator, what you also have is this Coleridge thing, this interfused self, which is itself the product of the shape of what all that firing and wiring, what all that neural mapping has done, and what it has rendered in terms of the individual. And one can certainly project healing in terms of one's inner space. After my back thing, I imaged, we had gone to Paris Eiffel Tower in 2003, and there's mannequins showing how the workers built it. And I imagined those characters going up and down my spine with a toothbrush, which I should be doing. That's the thing about life, is that you make some understandings and then you file it and then you move on. And that's, this preemptiveness of our selection process, that we don't always do what's good for us. For example, in that imagining it on the Rideau Canal, I could say, well, gee whiz, I imagine myself there, beautiful morning, ice marks on below me, and this whole beautiful world opening up, and I say to myself in that moment, I don't really do all the things that I should be doing for myself. I should do this more often, and so on. So that's one aspect of a poignant experience, and that's going to register with a certain depth, of course. And then when one, creates this poignancy, as it were, throughout the imagination, so that it becomes part of this intuition, part of one's apprehension, one's prehension, one's look into the future, given the trajectories of one's own neurological habits, where does that go, and how can one, populate the future with better interior events that aren't going to leave you stranded. So for me, a lot of diseases have common bases. Parkinson's, one's nervous system reacts to one's lack of well, it comes as an emotional lightning bolt, I think, and pulverizes the body, but it has come late, and it has come ruthlessly. Alzheimer's, in a similar sense, there's usually an event to which an old person comes to in their own narrative where they can't reconcile what they did with who they are and what they now think of themselves. And it's been a barrier for years. They've suppressed it and repressed it, and then it rears its ugly head and scares them back on their haunches. This is the terror of the mind, the absolute terror of a mind that slips away from one. So bipolarity, that's very understandable in terms of the hot code medium McLuhanisms that go down daily, and how we bracket our minds, and how ultimately we don't take time to anchor. The speed of displacement of information on a daily basis is fantastical. Hyperspace, and we get displaced, so this moment gets displaced by the one immediately coming down the line. And yes, there's a congestion, a congealing of information around certain big stories, like the coronavirus now, but diminished coverage of other things that might personalize our reality. And I think, one of my heroes is certainly Eric Blair, George Orwell, and thinking about the courage he had to penetrate. Same with Chelsea Manley and Snowden. What's his first name? I always want to mix it up. But these are brave creatures, and there are others who have stuck their necks out for Assange, for us. Or at least the end result is really and truly for us. And yet we want to circumscribe, fire and wire this neuromap that makes us a conformist, like W.H. Auden's Unknown Citizen, or like the process that Holden Caulfield faces in Catcher in the Rye, this anonymity of everything and alienation from his own parents, who seem on a different wavelength and nobody to associate with, to digest the death of his younger brother, who he saw as such a spontaneously beautiful creature. And that distortion and dysfunctionalism is certainly hyper apparent with Orwell when he goes to boarding school, but it's also apparent in every school. A lot of private schools, the sexual assault stuff going on in Toronto, currently at the one of the ritziest private schools around. This beguiling of it's like the NBA guy who basically was saying the coronavirus is a hoax, and he grabs a microphone and puts his hands over everything and contracts a disease. And one wonders in terms of the irony of such an event, because it's true. What is the chance that he doing that in that time and space is going to somehow instigate the disease? But there's a lot in terms of serendipity, the echo chamber, the different aspects of our very fluid reality. That one can polarize areas within the brain that then become, resolved because of the sort of natural selection processing that goes on there, that tries to be dutiful and respectful and humble about the complexity and about the need to remain, intellectually rigorous. Always aware that the human brain wants to solidify its information into material like dark flow, dark energy, dark matter. This process seems to be a universal process, and this, expression of life coming through your brain and opening up into the prism of selfhood that puts you somewhere on the spectrum between, subjective and imaginative and objective and uncertain in other realms. I don't want to belittle anything. We're all capable of moving that needle towards more subjectivity, and that's what everyone on the spectrum needs. So when one thinks about psychopaths or sociopaths, these are people without feelings. They're over on the male extreme side of the syndrome. In a sense, there's in every 10 to 20 blocks there's some creep waiting to murder or rape or kill somebody. We need to do something about the psychology. In terms of Alzheimer's, people suggest it's an epidemic of Alzheimer's, and I would agree. Depression, by 2025, 1/4 of the world is supposed to be depressed. We must be doing something wrong. Bipolarity, attention deficit, all these things are congealing in this mind that is running out of control. And sometimes even the people who step up to the microphone a bit, like brain plasticity, seem to miss some of the crucial points, like the brain that changes itself and Norman Deutsch and so on. I would have to, pick a different point of view, or put a different point of view forward on some of what he's suggesting there. Because when a human being is given attention in any study, that human being is going to flower and blossom. We blossom because of human attention. So one has to be very careful, not clinically careful, no, much more broad-based, conceptually careful about what one thinks one's actually understanding in the neurology that's going down. But at any rate, all this, information about plasticity, about neurogenesis, being able to tap into a brand new brain, which should be there in terms of stem cells. We should be able to actually reinvigorate our whole self. And it's right there, the science, and then not to mention all the, the dark energy, uncertainty, and Heisenberg's uncertainty, and the whole notion of quantum physics, and where does it, begin to mitigate relativity and vice versa, and, where are the thresholds and what are the epochs ahead of understanding if we, potentially last that long. But our propensity, our own probability cycle, tends to circumscribe a cultural reality that downplays things like Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli and what they were saying about the universe and consciousness and how we need to integrate in a respectful manner the archetypal realities that constitutes, these two are sort of like right there on the spectrum. And this sort of omnidirectional necessity of consciousness to create and sustain rigor in terms of brain plasticity and creativity, learning another language, all these things that create the stimulus for the brain to leap into new territory, new adventure. This is what you precisely want in terms of that sort of reality. Okie doke.